Hello and welcome back. We'll continue with our lessons on Chapter 2, and in this video, we'll be looking at 2.3 Biogeochemical Cycle. Once again, I'm Miss Delia, and if you're ready, let's continue. Now, the word biogeochemical cycle may sound intimidating to you, but it's actually something that you learned about before. Remember when you were in school, you learned your first biogeochemical cycle, which was the water cycle. Jadi kitaran air itu sudah adalah merupakan salah satu biogeochemical cycle yang asas dan penting di bumi kita. So you've already known about this water stuff. We're going to be learning about a few other elements and how they are cycled in the earth. So if we look at learning outcomes, I hope that by the end of this lesson, you will be able to describe the biogeochemical cycle components in carbon and nitrogen cycles, and then you would be able to illustrate the phosphorus cycle. And of course, before we learn about each of those three cycles, we'll first define what is a biogeochemical cycle. Biogeochemical cycle is the cycling of nutrients through an ecosystem involving both biotic and abiotic components. The cycling of matter from the abiotic environment to organism and then back to the environment is a biogeochemical cycle. And each cycle summarizes the movement of chemical elements through the living components of ecosystem. Biogeochemical cycles are divided into two components, which is the reservoir pool and the cycling. Jadi secara ringkasnya, kalau mau translate apa yang ada dalam teks ini, first kita tengok definisi biogeochemical cycle. Itu adalah poin pertama. Okay, so the first point was just the definition. Ini adalah kitaran elemen itu. Melalui seluruh ekosistem, dia masuk dan keluar daripada komponen abiotik dan komponen biotik. Dan yang penting, paling hujung ni kita cakap, biogeochemical cycle dibagikan kepada dua komponen, reservoir pool and cycling pool. You can say reservoir, some people read it as reservoir, something like that, but I like to say reservoir, even though it is VOIR. Okay, so that's just how I want to say it. Just to translate, reservoir can be translated as takungan. Cycling, I'm not sure how is the proper translation, tapi kita boleh anggap cycling itu adalah dia apabila elemen itu digunakan, dan biasanya digunakan oleh organisme yang hidup, the biotic. Usually, it's like that. So let's continue to compare between the reservoir pool and the cycling pool. First things first, the reservoir pool is usually made up of the abiotic components in the ecosystem, whereas the cycling pool will make up the biotic components of the ecosystem. In the reservoir pool, the chemical elements are in larger quantity, whereas in the cycling pool, the chemical elements are in a smaller quantity. Another thing to compare is that in reservoir pools, the chemical elements are in their inorganic forms, in the abiotic components of the biosphere. Whereas when you are talking about the cycling pool, the chemical elements or the nutrients are in their complex organic forms along food chain in the biotic components of the biosphere. So saya tekankan sekali lagi, reservoir pool, bentuk chemical itu adalah dalam bentuk inorganic di dalam abiotic component. Kalau dia dalam cycling pool, chemical element itu berada dalam bentuk complex organic form. Biasanya dia terduduk di dalam rangkaian makanan dan dia akan berada di dalam komponen biotik. So those are some comparisons between the reservoir pool and the cycling pool. In these biogeochemical cycles that you learn about, the chemical elements in the reservoir pool will be absorbed by the biotic components in the cycling pool, and then eventually they will release that chemical element back to the reservoir pool. So dia akan diserap dan melepaskan dan diserap lagi dan melepaskan lagi. So dia akan membentuk satu kitaran sebegini. Okay, so that is just the very basic plan of all biogeochemical cycles. After this slide, we're going to continue with the carbon cycle, and then after that, the nitrogen, and last but not least, we'll look at the phosphorus cycle. So, 3 elemen yang kita akan tengok nanti, C, N, dan P. If you remember what you learned in chapter 1 last semester, these elements make up the basic molecules that allow life to live. C, N, P, H, O, semua ini terdapat dalam kita punya carbohydrate, dalam kita punya lipid, dalam kita punya nucleic acid, dalam kita punya protein. That's why we focus a lot on the biotic components in biogeochemical cycles and where they take those elements from. And what happens after the biotic components die? Where does the elements go to? Okay, so pikirkan pasal benda tu, pikirkan pasal molekul-molekul dalam badan kamu semasa kita tengok setiap cycle. Alright, so if you're ready, let's get started with the very first cycle. We'll talk about the carbon cycle. To learn about the carbon cycle, I would first like to introduce you to the main characters, which are the abiotic and biotic components. First one of all, we have the carbon dioxide that is found in the atmosphere. Secondly, we have dissolved carbon dioxide in aquatic environments. So ini adalah carbon dioxide yang terlarut dalam laut, dalam sungai, dan mana-mana badan air. We can also talk about the carbon that is found in parts of the organisms. So this is what I mentioned earlier. You can find carbon in the carbohydrates, in the lipids, in the proteins, in the nucleic acids. Not only in animals, such as humans, but also in plants and other microorganisms. We can find carbon in fossil fuels, such as oil and gas and coal. And we can also find carbon in soil and limestone. Bagi yang tidak tahu, limestone adalah batu kapur. So this is put into an illustration. This is where you can find the components of the carbon cycle. Now, I want to break it down a little bit more. Okay, CO2 in atmosphere and dissolved CO2 masih sama. Untuk yang organism itu, saya bahagikan kepada plant, animals. Dalam air pun ada plants and algae, also aquatic animals. Carbonates in sediment is referring to soil and limestone, whereas fossil fuels is still the same but deep under. Okay, so ini adalah komponen-komponen dia. Sekarang kita akan belajar pasal proses. Let's get started with the very first process. So first things first, photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can be absorbed by plants through photosynthesis. And after that, it will be stored as carbohydrates in the plants. When animals consume the plants, they will absorb that carbon from the plant and make it part of the organism. Plants and animals can release that carbon back into the atmosphere through respiration. Jadi bila tumbuhan dan haiwan bernafas, dia akan keluarkan karbon dioksida kembali kepada atmosphere. So you see here we've started photosynthesis and respiration. All plants and animals will eventually die. So when they do, they experience death and decay. Dia mati dan bangkainya akan diuraikan. Bila diuraikan, proses penguraian akan membebaskan carbon dioxide. Decomposition process of dead organisms will release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So that shows a pretty simple flow for the terrestrial living organisms involved in carbon cycle. Now let's move to the left side of the diagram and have a look at what happens in the aquatic environment. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can become dissolved in water and become dissolved carbon dioxide. Dissolved carbon dioxide could also be released back into the atmosphere. So yang di udara boleh terlarut dalam air, yang terlarut dalam air boleh keluar balik kepada udara. So this is interchangeable. The carbon dioxide that is dissolved in the water can be absorbed by plants and algae through photosynthesis. So this is photosynthesis done by aquatic plants and algae. When animals in the water eat the aquatic plants or algae, they will absorb the carbon from those organisms and makes it part of their body. Animals, even though they're in the water, they still do respiration, and through respiration, they will release carbon dioxide back into the water. So it becomes the dissolved carbon dioxide once again. When these plants, algae, and animals in the water die, they will sink to the bottom of the water, reach the bottom, and sometimes they can be incorporated as part of fossil fuel. Jadi, ini bukannya proses yang sekejap lah. Ini proses yang mengambil masa yang panjang. It's a process that could take years, even millions of years. Okay? Haiwan, tumbuhan yang mati, dasar laut, dasar air, dia akan ditutup, terbenam. It's gonna get buried by sediments, by soil and sand, etc. And after many years, thousands if not millions of years, it's going to be compressed. That extra pressure under the many layers of the earth will change these dead organisms into fossil fuel that we can later harvest as oil and gas and coal. So this is not only applied for marine organisms, but also sometimes from terrestrial organisms as well. So itulah ada dua anak panas ini, organism yang mati ada kemungkinan menjadi fossil fuel. And looking at these fossil fuels, they can be burned to produce heat, to produce energy. So kalau kita bakar arang dan sebagainya, itu adalah proses pembakaran, combustion. We have more options than just fossil fuels. We can also burn plants. So contoh, kita dapatkan kayu balak, kayu api, sebagainya, kita bakar. Through the combustion process, we are releasing more carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. There is one more component here that we'll talk about last but not least, is the carbonates in the sediment. So carbonates in sediments such as limestone can be dissolved back into the water as bicarbonates. Bicarbonates, through weathering, will become released into the water as dissolved carbon dioxide. And then that dissolved carbon dioxide can stay in the water, or it becomes part of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Untuk bahagian sediment and limestone ini, untuk syllabus kamu sekarang kita tidak berapa tekankan macam mana limestone itu ataupun sediment lain itu terbentuk. If you want to learn more about that, feel free. If you want to Google it just to learn what is limestone and how limestone is formed, be my guest. But I don't want to cover it in this video, and you don't have to memorize that much about limestone for this syllabus. Okay, cukuplah kamu tahu bahawa karbonat dalam sediment seperti limestone boleh dibebaskan dalam bentuk bicarbonate, dan melalui proses lulu hawa, weathering is lulu hawa, it will be released as dissolved carbon dioxide. Here are the processes that are involved in the carbon cycle. So kamu perlu tahu macam mana mau describe photosynthesis, apa itu cellular respiration, apa itu decomposition, apa itu combustion, ataupun burning of biomass, ataupun burning of biofuels. Mana-mana lah. Yang penting kamu cakap pasal sesuatu itu dibakar. Dan kamu perlu tahu apa itu weathering. Weathering is not penghakisan, it is lulu hawa. Moving on. Okay, before we conclude this part about the carbon cycle, I would like to ask you, which are the reservoir pools of the carbon cycle? Based on this diagram, the reservoir pools of the carbon cycle are the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, dissolved carbon dioxide in water, carbonates in sediments such as limestone, and in fossil fuel. So these four are the reservoir pools for the carbon cycle. Okay, I hope that's clear. If you have any questions, Please feel free to ask in the comments below or during class, and I'm going to move on to the next biogeochemical cycle. So, second cycle that we'll learn about today is the terrestrial nitrogen cycle. Once again, before we talk about the processes, we're going to introduce you to the components in the nitrogen cycle. Jadi watak-watak utama yang kita akan belajar adalah animal and plant. And also, you're going to learn about atmospheric nitrogen. So this is nitrogen gas that you can find in the air around you. We also learned about NH3. NH3 is ammonia. We also learned about NH4+, which is ammonium, NO2 negative, which is nitrite, NO3 negative, which is nitrate. And putting that in an image, we have this picture of the nitrogen cycle. Since humans are also animals, I'll be sitting here next to the animals and the plants. And now we'll learn about the processes involved in the nitrogen cycle. So we'll start with atmospheric nitrogen. Where will atmospheric nitrogen go? It will undergo nitrogen fixation by nitrogen-fixing bacteria and become ammonia. So kalau ada bakteria yang boleh buat nitrogen fixation, dia akan ambil nitrogen daripada persekitaran dan jadikan dia kepada NH3, ammonia. Another method of nitrogen fixation is through the skies. Okay, so lightning, rain, thunderstorm can have natural nitrogen fixation, but it doesn't produce ammonia, it will produce nitrate. So this weather, it will become NO3 negative. Now, what happens after we get ammonia? Ammonia can undergo ammonification by bacteria to form ammonium. So, kalau ada bakteria yang sesuai di dalam tanah itu, dia akan ambil NH3, laksanakan ammonification, dan hasilkan NH4+, which is ammonium. Ammonium can also be produced through a process of decomposition. So the ammonia from bacteria or ammonia from animals or ammonia from plants can be decomposed by bacteria or fungi to produce ammonium. Okay, so bila benda-benda ini mati, dia akan decompose oleh fungi ataupun bacteria untuk menjadi ammonium. Ammonium then continues in the cycle to become NO2 negative, which is nitrite, through a process called nitrification. So through nitrification, NH4+ will become NO2 negative. NO2 negative can undergo nitrification to become NO3 negative. So daripada nitrite, dia jadi nitrate. Now we have a lot of ammonia, ammonium, nitrite, nitrate in the soil. Which one can be used by the plants? Well, the first one that the plants will take is nitrate, NO3 negative. So it will be taken up into the plant through a process called assimilation. Bila tumbuhan serap nitrate daripada tanah, itu digelar sebagai assimilation. Plants don't only take nitrate, they can also take ammonium. So NH4+ pun boleh diserap oleh tumbuhan melalui proses assimilation untuk dijadikan sebagai komponen badannya sendiri. So to answer the previous question, plants can take up nitrate, NO3 negative, and ammonium, NH4+. When those plants are eaten by animals, the animals will get that nitrogen and incorporate it into their body. And the last process in the nitrogen cycle is denitrification. Kalau ada nitrate yang tidak digunakan, dia mungkin diambil oleh bakteria lain, dan bakteria itu akan membuat denitrification. This is nitrifying bacteria. It's going to take that nitrate and after denitrification, release it back to the atmosphere in the form of nitrogen gas. So, inilah dia punya proses. Kalau kamu tengok pada gambar raja ini, kalau dia warna merah, dia adalah nitrogen fixation. Kalau dia warna biru cerah, dia adalah ammonification. Kalau dia adalah biru gelap, itu adalah assimilation. Kuning adalah nitrification. Two products. And the purple one is denitrification. So take your time to have a look at this diagram. Do try to draw this diagram yourself. Hopefully it will make you understand. The processes involved are nitrogen fixation, nitrification, ammonification, assimilation, and denitrification. The 4 types of bacteria involved in the nitrogen cycle are, first of all, decomposers, denitrifying bacteria, nitrifying bacteria, and nitrogen-fixing bacteria. We'll talk about each of those processes now. First things first is nitrogen fixation. Ini yang warna merah anak panah dia. Nitrogen fixation is the conversion of nitrogen gas to ammonia to enrich the nitrogen source in the soil. Nitrogen fixation can be done in 3 ways. The first is through biological fixation, which is the conversion of nitrogen gas to ammonia by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So, ini adalah yang paling kiri daripada diagram kita tadi. Paling kiri sekali, itu adalah through biological fixation. So, example of nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil are rhizobium species and azotobacter species. Biasa dengar punya lah 2 nama. And you could also have nitrogen-fixing bacteria in aquatic environments such as cyanobacteria. Dalam gambar raja kita tadi dan dalam syllabus kamu, kita fokus lebih banyak kepada terrestrial nitrogen cycle. So, yang air punya ada lagi komponen dia lain. Tapi kita tidak masuk secara mendalam, cuma dalam part ini saya bagi tahu. Dalam aquatic environment, yang akan buat biological nitrogen fixation adalah cyanobacteria. Alright, the second way that we can produce we can dupe nitrogen fixation is through atmospheric fixation. So, ini adalah kilat dan hujan lebat yang saya tunjuk di sebelah kanan diagram tadi. Nitrogen atmospheric fixation is when the energy in lightning breaks nitrogen molecules and enables their atoms to combine with oxygen in the air, forming nitrogen dioxide, NO2. NO2 that dissolves in rain to form nitrous rain and nitric acid, which react with other compounds to form nitrate NO3 negative in the soil. So, kilat itu akan menyebabkan N2 bergabung dengan oksigen menjadi NO2. Bila dia terlarut dalam air hujan, dibawa kepada tanah, dia bercampur dengan barang-barang lain dalam tanah, dia akan menjadi NO3 negative. The third way that we can produce ammonia is through industrial fixation. So this is by Haber process, which is the production of ammonia NH3 as fertilizer. Inilah yang dibuat dalam kilang. Dalam diagram tadi, saya cuma tunjukkan method A and method B. Method C is man-made, and so it was not introduced in the normal cycle diagram that we learned about. Okay, so that is for nitrogen fixation. Now we talk about nitrification or nitrification. Macam mana lah kamu mo? For nitrification, it is the conversion of ammonia or NH3 or ammonium ion, NH4+, to nitrate, NO3 negative, by nitrifying bacteria. So, sama ada kita start dengan NH3 ataupun NH4+, asalkan dia punya end product, penghujungnya dia menjadi NO3 negative, itu adalah nitrification process. Nitrifying bacteria that can do this is Nitrosomonas species, which will convert ammonium to nitrites. We also have Nitrobacter species, which convert nitrite to nitrates. And of course, there are also other bacteria out there that could do nitrification, but in your syllabus and based on the diagram that I was teaching you with earlier, we only learned about the Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter species. Dan ini adalah bakteria yang sangat biasa lazim dijumpai dalam tanah juga lah. So if you're learning more about agriculture, maybe you need to learn more about these nitrogen fixation and nitrification bacteria as well. Now let's continue on to the third process in the nitrogen cycle, which is assimilation. Plants can use two inorganic forms of nitrogen, which is ammonium and nitrate, NH4 plus and NO3 negative. Animals can only use organic forms of nitrogen. So, plants boleh ambil terus dari tanah. Animals tidak boleh ambil terus dari tanah. Dia mesti makan tumbuhan yang ada nitrogen. So, nitrate, which is NO3 negative, and ammonium ion, NH4 plus, are absorbed by the roots and used to make organic compounds. Assimilation includes the conversion of plant proteins into animal proteins as well. So, bila haiwan makan tumbuhan, itu juga digelar sebagai assimilation. The fourth process is ammonification. Ammonification is the conversion of organic nitrogen compounds to ammonia, NH3, or ammonium ion, NH4 plus, by decomposers. So this is only done by bacteria and fungi. They're going to take nitrogen from dead animals, dead plants, etc., and turn that into ammonia or ammonium ion. And the fifth process is denitrification. It is the conversion of nitrates, which is NO3 negative, into nitrogen gas. And so this is done by denitrifying bacteria such as Pseudomonas species. So this one is the purple colored arrow in the diagram earlier. So those are the 5 processes that are involved in the nitrogen cycle. Before we conclude the nitrogen cycle, another quick question. Which one is the reservoir? Looking at this diagram, which one do you think is the reservoir for the nitrogen cycle? The answer is the atmosphere. The only reservoir is the atmosphere. Everything else is part of the cycling pool. So that's it for the nitrogen cycle. Good job for sticking in so far. And we're going to continue with the third and the final biogeochemical cycle for this lesson, which is the phosphorus cycle. So when we talk about the phosphorus cycle, we are talking about phosphorus, which is mainly found in water, soil, and rock. Phosphorus cannot be found in the air or in the gaseous state. So dia sama ada terlarut dalam air ataupun dia duduk. Atmosphere will not be involved in the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is still very essential for life because it makes up a component of DNA, RNA, and our phospholipids. They are also one of the building blocks for your bones and teeth. So that is the significance of us learning about the phosphorus cycle. Alright, so if you're ready, let's continue. In this next slide, we will go and learn about the cycle and first and foremost about its pawatak-watak. The first component, abiotic, it is the phosphate or PO4 3 negative that is found in rocks. So this is phosphate. The second is also phosphate, but this is phosphate that is found in the soil and also dissolved phosphate in the water. So sama juga PO4 3 negative, tapi satu dalam batu, satu tanah, satu dalam air. Ta-da! As shown in this diagram here. So the purple dots that I show there are supposed to be the dissolved phosphate. Okay, the next components are the plants and also animals, and we'll learn about them through the processes. The first process is uptake of phosphates by plants. So plants boleh terus serap phosphate daripada tanah. Bila dia serap, okay, it's going to be part of the plant itself. After that, when animals eat plants through the process of consumption, they will absorb that phosphate and incorporate it into their body. As the animal produces waste, buang air besar, buang air kecil, ataupun bila haiwan itu mati, ataupun bila tumbuhan itu mati, so through their waste products or through their death, they are going to release that phosphorus back into the soil. So through the waste and the decomposition of dead organisms, phosphorus will be returned back into the soil. It's going to become phosphate in the soil again. Now we'll learn about the water part of the phosphorus cycle. So ini, tengah-tengah ini, sudah dia punya terrestrial phosphorus. Now we go into aquatic phosphorus cycle. So we have phosphate that is dissolved in the water, and we have plankton that are in the water. The dissolved phosphate can be taken up by plankton in the water. So dia terus ambil. Dan bila dia mati ataupun bila plankton itu excrete, they can excrete material, although we don't count it as poop. They can produce excretions, and those excretions can release more dissolved phosphate back into the water. The dissolved phosphate could also fall to the bottom of the water and become sediment. So dia mungkin akan mendap di dasar air, dasar laut, dasar sungai, dan menjadi sebahagian daripada sediment, mendapan. So this process of sedimentation is going to produce sedimentary rock. So phosphate dalam air yang mendap di dasar boleh dimasukkan ke dalam sedimentary rock. Sedimentation can become incorporated into sedimentary rock. You can learn more about the types of rocks if you want to, or you can just remember that sedimentary rocks is a rock that is formed from many things falling, and then they impede and it forms layers and layers and layers. Okay, so once it is part of the sedimentary rock, it's going to sit under the earth, just duduk di sana. But if you remember, this earth is a very dynamic place, so sometimes the plates on the earth can move around, rocks move here, rock move there, even though everything looks fine on top. It melalui pergerakan kerak bumi dan sebagainya. Sometimes these sedimentary rock that were under can be brought back to the surface. So when those rocks that are down there goes up to the surface, it is a process called geological uplift. So through geological uplift, rock that is down here is brought up there. So now it becomes rock on surface, which makes it phosphate that is in surface rock. Phosphate that is in surface rocks, kadang-kadang dia ini batu biasa saja. Kadang-kadang ini adalah sebahagian daripada gunung yang tinggi, dia sebahagian daripada tebing yang curam, dan sebagainya. So these phosphate in rocks is not just the small rocks on the ground. It could also be the rocks on a mountain, rocks on a cliff, etc., etc., etc. And once it's exposed to the surface, it's also exposed to weathering. Okay, ini akan terdedah kepada proses luluh hawa. So through weathering, you can imagine the layers of the rock are slowly being taken off, weathered, and it gets taken down by the rainwater, by the wind, etc. And slowly it becomes the phosphate that is found in soil. Kamu boleh bayangkan kan? Luluh hawa ataupun hakisan daripada batu-batu di atas dibawa sebagai debu dan sebagainya dan menjadi sebahagian daripada tanah, weathered to become part of. And so it continues and continues to this part of the cycle once. I hope that is clear. The phosphorus cycle is quite simple compared to the other ones, because as long as you can picture the animals, the rock, the soil, and the water, you can pretty much visualize how this is going to flow. So kamu boleh ikut gambar yang saya lukis. Cuba untuk lukis sendiri. Harap-harap itu dapat membantu kamu untuk ingatlah. So before I conclude about the phosphorus cycle, once again, I'm asking you the familiar question. In this biogeochemical cycle, which one is the reservoir? If you're looking at this diagram, the reservoirs are the rocks, and that's about it. It's only the rocks. The ones in soil and the ones that are in the water are considered part of the cycling pool. The only one that is part of the reservoir pool is the rock. Okay, so that is pretty much it for the phosphorus cycle. Just a very quick summary. In this lesson, we have gone through the definition of biogeochemical cycle, and then we learned about the first biogeochemical cycle of this chapter, which is carbon cycle, and then you learn about the nitrogen cycle, and last but not least, about the phosphorus cycle. Saya mohon kamu untuk ingat apa dia punya reservoir pool untuk setiap cycle tersebut. Dan untuk nitrogen cycle, kamu perlu ingat itu 5 proses yang ada. For nitrogen cycle, you really have to remember the 5 processes that are involved in the nitrogen cycle. And if possible, try to remember the different molecules, names, and the bacteria that are involved as well. So ingatlah mana dia jadi ammonia, mana dia jadi ammonium, mana dia jadi nitrite, mana dia jadi nitrate, dan bila dia jadi balik kepada nitrogen. Try to remember that. And for the carbon cycle, it's fairly simple, but try to follow as many of the processes as possible. Itu pun kalau tidak silap ada 5 proses, asalkan kamu ada ingat punya proses, kamu boleh ingat balik. For phosphorus cycle, you really have to remember how to draw. Okay? Perlu ingat macam mana mau lukis phosphorus cycle. So that's the end of the subtopic. What should you do now? You should come up with your own notes. In your notes, and as part of the exercise, I would like you to draw the 3 biogeochemical cycles and then submit them in the Google Classroom. So, bila kamu lukis biogeochemical cycle itu, kamu tidak mau lukis dia punya background, tidak apa. Yang penting kamu tulis setiap komponen dia. When you draw your biogeochemical cycles, I want you to draw each of the components that I show in this video. If you feel creative and you want to add your own background, add colors, add drawings, etc., feel free. But the most important thing is you have your components. You can do this traditionally. Kalau mau lukis guna tangan pun boleh. Kalau mau lukis secara digital, so if you want to draw it with your iPad or you want to make your own infograph about it, feel free to do so. It's completely up to you and how much time you have. After you're done drawing your 3 biogeochemical cycles, please complete the tutorial question, Chapter 2, Part B, Question 1, which is shown down here, down there. Alright, that is quite the long subtopic. Thank you very much for listening and for your time and your attention, and I will see you again soon. Happy learning! Bye!